The
Don't you
invitation.
dare.
The envelope lay quietly among the day's mail, its golden seal glinting beneath the kitchen light. Grace paused before touching it, her fingertips hovering over the familiar crest of her old high school. 30 years had passed since she had last seen that name printed on anything she owned. Her heart began to thud with a rhythm she thought she had long forgotten. The words "Class of 1994 30th Reunion" shimmered on the envelope. Grace stared at it for several seconds, before opening it with a letter opener that trembled in her hand. Inside was a thick, glossy invitation embossed with silver lettering. The font was elegant, nostalgic, almost cruel in its cheerfulness. For a long moment, she simply stood there in her kitchen, the invitation heavy in her fingers. The sound of the refrigerator's hum filled the silence. Grace hadn't thought about high school in years, not willingly. Those memories came only in dreams, unwanted and gray. She thought of Lydia Reynolds, the girl who had made her teenage years a daily trial. Beautiful, rich, confident, cruel. Grace's stomach tightened as if her body still remembered the sting of old laughter. Her daughter Emily entered the kitchen, holding a mug of tea. "Mom? What's that?" Grace forced a smile. "An invitation. The reunion." Emily's eyes brightened. "You should go. It could be fun. See your old friends." Grace laughed softly. "Friends, huh? That's one word for it." She placed the invitation on the counter and tried to act indifferent, but curiosity tugged at her. She wondered what Lydia looked like now, if life had been kind to her, if karma had done its quiet work. Emily leaned against the counter, studying her mother's expression. "You've moved on, right?" she asked gently. Grace hesitated. "I thought I had." That evening, after Emily went to bed, Grace sat by her desk and reread the invitation under the glow of a small lamp. There would be music, dinner, speeches, nothing she hadn't endured before, yet something inside her whispered that she needed to go, not to prove anything to others, but to herself. She opened her old jewelry box, untouched for years, and found a keychain engraved with her late husband's initials. He had always told her, "You face the things that hurt you most, that's how you heal." Grace picked up her phone and searched for nearby hotels. Her fingers hesitated before confirming the booking. 2 nights, she murmured. That should be enough to relive a lifetime. The following week came faster than she expected. On the morning of the reunion, she stood before her mirror, smoothing the wrinkles on her blue dress. Her reflection showed silver threads in her hair, and the quiet strength of someone who had survived grief. She thought of her husband's funeral, of learning to live alone again, of the daughter who gave her reason to keep going. But still there was a shadow of that young girl inside her, standing in the school hallway, clutching books, pretending not to hear the laughter behind her. Grace took a deep breath and whispered, "Let's end this." She drove through her hometown for the first time in decades. The streets had changed, the stores replaced, the trees, older but the same familiar scent of wet asphalt after rain filled the air. Nostalgia collided with dread in her chest. The reunion was being held at a local country club, one she had never been invited to in her youth. When she arrived, the parking lot was already full. Elegant cars gleamed under the fading sunlight. Grace parked her modest sedan near the back and adjusted her coat. Her heels clicked softly on the pavement as she approached the entrance. She could hear faint laughter inside, the kind of laughter that belonged to people who never doubted their place in the world. A woman at the reception table smiled politely. "Name, please?" "Grace Miller," she replied. The woman scanned the list. "Welcome back, Grace. You're at table 5. Grace entered the grand hall, her eyes catching the chandeliers, the polished wood floors, the portraits of past principals framed along the walls. The air smelled of perfume, champagne, and nostalgia. Clusters of former classmates hugged, exchanged stories, and compared lives. She felt invisible, just as she once had, blending into the background like wallpaper. Then, a sudden burst of laughter echoed from across the room. A woman in a striking red dress turned, her golden hair perfectly styled. Lydia Reynolds. She was unmistakable, even time had bowed to her charm. Grace froze for a heartbeat, every muscle tense. Lydia's eyes swept across the room and briefly met hers. For a second, recognition flickered, then a smirk. Grace smiled faintly in return, not out of warmth but resolve. The night had begun, and she knew this was not just a reunion, it was a reckoning. The echoes of the past, The hall was alive with music and conversation when Grace entered, but beneath the laughter lingered the hum of anxiety she could not shake. Chandeliers spilled warm light over faces she barely recognized, yet the sound of a particular laugh stopped her cold. It was high-pitched, sharp, and unmistakably familiar. Lydia Reynolds, the same laugh that had echoed down locker-lined corridors decades ago, now sliced through the air once more. Grace moved toward the buffet table, pretending to study the appetizers. The scent of roasted meat and perfume filled her senses, but she could taste only nervousness. She avoided the crowd, keeping her eyes on the ice sculpture in the center. A few classmates noticed her, nodding politely before turning back to their louder conversations. The years had changed their faces, but not their social gravity. She still orbited on the outside. "Grace Miller?" A voice called from behind. Grace turned to see Mr. Hale, their old history teacher, older now, leaning on a cane. They exchanged brief smiles, the sort shared between two people who remember different versions of the same time. He complimented her for aging gracefully. She thanked him and drifted away before he could say more. Moments later, the doors opened again. Ben entered, carrying the same quiet confidence that had drawn Emily to him. He spotted Grace and waved warmly, his presence grounding her in the present. Lydia noticed too. From across the room, Lydia's gaze sharpened like glass. Within seconds, she approached, her red dress gliding across the polished floor. "Grace Miller," Lydia announced, her tone dripping with theatrical surprise. "You actually came." Grace smiled politely. "I did. 30 years is a long time." Lydia's eyes slid toward Ben. "And who's this?" "Quite the handsome date. My son-in-law," Grace replied evenly. "Oh," Lydia said, her smile tightening. "Of course. Family." The pause that followed was thick with unspoken memories. Lydia turned her attention to the small circle, forming around them, as if performing for an audience that hadn't been invited. "Do you all remember," she began loudly, "how Grace used to sit in the library, every lunch break? So serious, so shy." Laughter erupted from a few who only half remembered. Ben's posture stiffened. "Sounds like someone who liked to study," he said. Lydia's smirk faltered. "Yes, well, not everyone could be the life of the party." Grace set her drink down, her fingers steady. The old humiliation flickered inside her, but she didn't let it spread. Instead, she turned toward the buffet again. "Some of us preferred quieter joys," she said softly. Ben leaned closer. "You okay?" Grace nodded. "She hasn't changed." "That's almost comforting." When Lydia turned away to entertain another group, Grace excused herself to the restroom. The mirror's reflection showed a composed woman, but inside, her chest felt heavy. "Why did I come?" she whispered. From one of the stalls, two voices murmured. "Poor Lydia," one said. "She's pretending everything's fine, but her husband left months ago." "Really?" "I heard they lost most of their money, too." The gossipers left without noticing Grace. She stood motionless, processing the irony. Lydia Reynolds, the woman who once humiliated her for wearing hand-me-down shoes, was now struggling to keep her own world intact. When she returned to the hall, Lydia was still laughing, louder than ever. Surrounded by people who didn't know what to believe, Grace glanced at her and felt something unexpected, not pity, not anger, but curiosity. Ben walked up beside her. "You ready to go soon?" Grace shook her head. "Not yet. Something tells me this night isn't over." And as the band began to play an old-school song, Grace realized the past had followed her here not to haunt her but to finish what had never been resolved. The letter. Grace returned to her hotel long after the reunion lights had faded. The city outside hummed quietly, a contrast to the noise of the evening. She removed her heels and sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion pressing down like a heavy coat. The room smelled faintly of lavender soap and rain. Ben set 2 bottles of water on the table and handed her one. "You did great," he said gently. Grace smiled, though it felt hollow. When Ben stepped out to make a phone call, Grace reached for her purse. A small, time-worn keychain slipped out, her late husband's initials engraved in brass. The sight made her pause. Thomas had carried it through their early years, when money was tight, and kindness was their only luxury. He once mentioned helping someone from his old business circle, but never gave details. Now, that photograph of Lydia's father haunted her thoughts. She opened her laptop and searched through digital archives. her fingers moving faster than her heartbeat. Old charity articles appeared, listing Thomas Miller among local donors. One headline stood out: Local Entrepreneur Funds, School Renovation Partners with Dalton Family. Her eyes widened. Partners, not rivals, partners. She clicked the article, but the text was incomplete. The rest had been removed or lost to time. On impulse, she opened the folder, where she had stored scans of Thomas's letters after his passing. She scrolled until one file stopped her: a draft addressed to Mr. Dalton. The subject line read: regarding our last conversation. Grace opened it carefully, as though handling something alive. Dear Richard, I hope this finds you well. Please don't worry about repayment. What matters is that your business recovers. I believe in second chances. One day, I hope our children will meet without bitterness between them. Her hands trembled. Lydia's father had owed Thomas money, not the other way around. The feud, the gossip, the whispered blame, it had all been built on a lie. Ben returned, noticing her pale face. What happened? Grace turned the laptop toward him. This letter. Thomas helped her father. He saved him. Ben scanned the words, frowning. Then why did she? I don't think she ever knew. Grace interrupted softly. Or maybe she was told the opposite. They sat in silence. The hum of the air conditioner filled the room like static between thoughts. Grace leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He wanted peace, she whispered. Even then. Ben closed the laptop. So what will you do? Grace looked toward the window, where raindrops traced thin, trembling lines down the glass. Find out why this was buried, and then decide what to do with it. The rain grew heavier. Each drop sounded like a heartbeat against the pane. Grace lay awake long after midnight, replaying the evening scenes in her mind: the flash of the photograph, Lydia's shifting expression, the sudden weight of understanding. At dawn, pale light slipped through the curtains. The world outside looked washed clean. Grace rose, folded the letter printout, and slipped it into her bag. She dressed carefully, choosing a gray coat that matched the morning fog. Ben stirred. You're leaving already? I need to see something, she said. There's more to this. He nodded, understanding her tone. Want company? Yes, she said after a pause. This time, I don't want to go alone. They left the room quietly, the door clicking shut behind them. The elevator's reflection caught Grace's face, older, wiser, but carrying the same eyes that once looked for mercy in a cruel world. Some truths waited decades to be heard. She was done running from them. The confrontation. The hotel lobby smelled faintly of coffee and polished marble. When Grace stepped inside that morning, the echoes of suitcases rolling across the floor, mixed with the soft murmur of guests checking out. She pretended to browse the souvenir stand while scanning the room. At the far end, Lydia was speaking sharply to a clerk at the counter, her voice rising with each word. The mask of composure she wore last night had cracked. Grace approached slowly, her heels quiet on the tile. The clerk stammered, explaining that Lydia's payment had failed: an expired card, perhaps. Lydia's frustration spilled out like smoke. That's impossible. Try it again. The people nearby began to stare. Grace waited, her presence unnoticed until the clerk caught her eye with relief. Lydia turned, saw her, and froze. Oh, Lydia said coolly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Didn't expect an audience. Grace smiled politely. I forgot something in the dining room. Thought I'd stop by. Lydia sighed and handed the clerk another card. Still the same, aren't you? Always watching, never speaking. The charge went through. Lydia snatched the receipt and walked away without looking at Grace. Grace followed at a measured distance into the near-empty dining hall. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, scattering across linen-draped tables. Lydia dropped her purse on a chair and sank into it, exhausted. Grace took the seat opposite her. Lydia, she began softly, can I ask you something? Lydia didn't respond at first. She stared out the window, eyes glassy. Go ahead, everyone else has. Did your father ever mention knowing my husband, Thomas? The question cut through the quiet like a blade. Lydia's posture stiffened. Why? Grace slid her phone across the table, showing the digital letter. Because this was written to him. Lydia's eyes flicked to the screen. As she read, her breathing quickened, lines of confusion deepened on her forehead. She whispered, that can't be right, my father always said. Grace waited. Lydia scrolled further down, her lips parting in disbelief. The color drained from her face. He said your husband ruined us, Lydia murmured. He said the money was stolen. It wasn't, Grace said quietly. Thomas helped him. He never wanted recognition. Lydia's hand trembled as she set the phone down. He lied to me, she said flatly. My whole life, I carried that lie. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling, as if the truth itself were too heavy to face. For the first time, Grace saw not arrogance, but grief. Decades of bitterness seemed to crumble around them like dust. Lydia pressed her palms to her face, whispering, I made you pay for what he did, for what I thought he did. Grace folded her hands in her lap. We were both carrying ghosts. The silence that followed was long and raw. The hum of the air conditioner filled the space between them. Lydia lowered her hands, mascara streaking down her cheeks. I don't even know how to apologize for that. Maybe you start by not defending the past anymore, Grace said gently. Lydia looked out the window again. The morning sun reflected off the glass, bright and unforgiving. He was my hero, she whispered. I built everything on his word. Grace nodded. And now you can build something on truth. Lydia gave a small, broken laugh. You sound like Thomas. Grace smiled faintly. He believed kindness was strength. I never understood it until now. Neither woman moved for a long while. The dining hall around them slowly filled with the noise of breakfast service plates, clattering, chairs scraping, voices rising. Yet in that pocket of sunlight, two women who had spent a lifetime on opposite sides of a lie, simply sat together, the past unraveling quietly between them. When Grace finally stood, Lydia didn't stop her. She only said, I need time. Grace nodded once. Take it. The truth waited this long, it can wait a little more. As she left the room, Grace felt no triumph, only release. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain from the night before. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in both their hearts. The discovery. Grace and Ben drove through narrow streets until they reached the edge of town, where a row of old storage facilities stood against the grey horizon. Lydia had mentioned her father's office items being kept there years ago, a remnant of a business that had never recovered. The air smelled of rust and rain. A clerk led them through a dim corridor lined with metal doors until they found Unit 42. Grace hesitated before lifting the latch. Inside, boxes stacked to the ceiling greeted them, coated in dust thick enough to dull the labels. The stale scent of paper and time filled the small space. Grace switched on a hanging bulb, its yellow glow trembling. She read the handwriting on one box: Business Correspondence 1992. Another was marked Personal Letters. Ben helped her move the top crates aside. If what you think is true, he said, we might find proof here. Grace nodded, her heart thrumming like a pulse in her throat. She opened the box labeled 1992. Inside were binders, faded invoices, and brittle envelopes tied with a ribbon. She untied it carefully, revealing letters exchanged between Richard Dalton, Lydia's father, and several business partners. Most were routine payment reminders, contracts, and thank-you notes. But one envelope stood out. It was addressed to Thomas Miller yet still sealed. Grace's breath caught. She slipped a nail under the flap and opened it. The ink had faded, but the words were legible. Thomas, I've wronged you. Pride made me twist generosity into blame. You saved my company, yet I let others believe the opposite. I wanted my daughter to think I was strong, not a man who accepted help. I never found the courage to tell her the truth. Grace's vision blurred. She handed the paper to Ben, her hands trembling. He confessed, she said quietly. Ben read the lines slowly. He never sent it. Grace shook her head. He died with it in a box. Lydia never knew. They searched further and found financial ledgers, with entries showing deposits from Thomas Miller's company. The proof was undeniable. Lydia's family had survived because of the man she spent years despising. Grace sat on the concrete floor, the letter clutched against her chest. He never wanted anyone to know, she whispered. Even when they blamed him, he stayed silent, then crouched beside her. That's who he was, Grace. He thought truth would find its way, even without him. The bulb flickered overhead, casting long, wavering shadows across the boxes. Dust swirled in the air like ghosts released from years of silence. Grace carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. She needs to see this, she said. Ben nodded. Tonight? Yes. Before she convinces herself it's too late. As they left the unit, Grace paused at the door and looked back once more. The dim light revealed countless forgotten objects, awards, papers, trophies, all meaningless now beside one unsent letter. She locked the unit and handed the key to the clerk. "Some debts can't be paid with money," she murmured. Outside, the rain had started again, soft but persistent. They stood under the awning, the city skyline faint in the distance. Grace's reflection shimmered in a puddle at her feet, older, steadier, free from illusions. "Truth waited long enough," she said as they walked to the car. "Now it's time it was seen." Lydia's breakdown. The drive to Lydia's home was silent, except for the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. Night had fallen hard, wrapping the town in a steady drizzle. Grace clutched the envelope tightly in her lap. The letter from Richard Dalton, Lydia's father. It felt heavier than paper should. Ben parked outside a once grand house at the end of a tree-lined street. The windows were dark except for one faint light near the living room. Grace hesitated before stepping out. "You don't have to come in," she told Ben. "I'll wait here," he said. "Call me if you need to." The front door opened after several knocks. Lydia appeared, barefoot, wearing a wrinkled silk robe. Her mascara had run, staining the corners of her eyes. A half-empty wine bottle rested on the entry table behind her. "Oh," she said flatly, "the saint returns." "I need to show you something," Grace replied. Lydia gave a short laugh. "Unless it's a time machine, I'm not interested." Grace stepped forward, holding out the letter. "It's from your father." That silenced her. Lydia frowned, uncertain, then gestured toward the living room. "Fine, come in." The room was dim, filled with clutter, scattered mail, empty glasses, and framed photos of a younger Lydia smiling beside her father. Grace placed the envelope on the coffee table. Lydia stared at it but didn't touch it. "Go on," she muttered. Grace unfolded the letter, the paper, trembling between her fingers, and began to read aloud. Each sentence fell into the air like stones dropped in water. When she finished, the only sound was the rain outside. Lydia sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on nothing. Then she spoke, voice hoarse. "He lied to me." Grace said nothing. "He told me your husband betrayed him, stole his business, ruined everything." Lydia laughed bitterly. "And all this time, it was the opposite. He was the one saved." She stood abruptly, pacing. "Do you know what it's like to build your whole life on a story? To worship a man who wasn't who he said he was?" Grace watched her carefully. "Yes," she said quietly, "I buried one." Lydia stopped pacing. Her shoulders slumped as the fight drained out of her. She sank back into the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I humiliated you for years," she whispered. "I wanted someone to blame. It made me feel powerful." Grace sat across from her, her tone calm but firm. "You were angry at a ghost, Lydia. So was I." Tears streaked Lydia's face. She reached for an old photo frame and stared at it, a picture of her father lifting her onto his shoulders at a carnival. "He wasn't evil," she murmured, "just proud." "Pride ruins more than it protects," Grace said softly. Lydia suddenly tore the photo in half. The gesture was violent but empty. "Everything I believed in feels fake." Grace bent down, picking up one torn piece. "Not everything," she said gently. "You loved him. That part was real." Lydia's sobs broke the stillness. She cried until her voice was raw, years of resentment and grief spilling into the air. Grace stayed seated, unmoving, offering silent witness. When Lydia finally looked up, her eyes were red but clearer. "Why are you here?" she asked. "You should hate me." "I did," Grace admitted, "but hate keeps you in the same place forever." Lydia exhaled shakily. "What am I supposed to do now?" "Start with the truth," Grace said, "and maybe stop drinking." That earned the faintest smile. "Always the sensible one," Lydia whispered. Grace stood, adjusting her coat. "Rest. Tomorrow, you can decide what comes next." Lydia nodded weakly. "Will you come back?" "Yes," Grace said, heading for the door. "But next time, let's talk like two women, not ghosts." Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean again. Grace paused at the end of the walkway, glancing back at the house. Through the window, Lydia sat slumped on the couch, cradling the letter like a fragile relic. For the first time, Grace saw her not as a villain, but as someone finally meeting the truth. She whispered into the quiet, "It's over now," though she wasn't sure if she meant the past or the pain itself. Then she turned and walked toward the car, where Ben waited under the streetlight, the future quietly unfolding beyond the dark. The morning after, sunlight crept through the thin curtains of the hotel room, painting soft lines across the carpet. Grace stirred awake to the faint vibration of her phone on the nightstand. The screen displayed a message from Lydia. "Thank you." Just 2 words, but they lingered like the echo of a confession. Grace read them several times before setting the phone down. The world outside was calm, washed clean by the night's rain. For the first time in years, her chest didn't feel heavy. She brewed coffee using the small machine on the counter, the aroma filling the quiet room. The sound of the slow drip was soothing, steady, predictable. Ben emerged from the adjoining room, still half asleep. "You okay?" Grace nodded. "Better than I expected." "Did she read it?" "Yes, and she cried." Ben poured himself a cup. "Good. Sometimes that's the only way people see clearly." Grace sat by the window, watching early commuters hurry along the wet sidewalks. A couple laughed under a shared umbrella, their reflections blurring in puddles. Life, she thought, had a way of moving forward even when hearts lagged behind. "I think I'm done looking backward," she said quietly. Ben smiled. "Then let's make breakfast a celebration." They went down to the cafe in the lobby. The chatter of other guests surrounded them, families planning day trips, couples whispering over coffee. Grace's plate of pancakes sat untouched for a moment. As she gazed out the large window, the world looked ordinary again, not haunted. "You know," Ben said, breaking the silence, "Lydia might reach out again. What will you do if she does?" Grace considered. "I'll answer, but on my terms this time." She sipped her coffee and smiled faintly. "Funny thing," she added, "I used to dream of seeing her miserable, but last night, when she broke down, all I felt was pity." "That's growth," Ben said. "No," she corrected softly, "that's freedom." After breakfast, Grace decided to take a walk. She wandered through the town square, where the reunion banners still fluttered in the breeze. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery she'd once avoided as a teenager. Afraid of running into classmates, now she entered it without hesitation. Inside, an elderly man greeted her warmly. "Haven't seen you before," he said. Grace smiled. "It's been a long time." She bought a small loaf and stepped back into the sunlight. Across the street stood her old high school, its brick walls weathered but familiar. Children ran across the yard, their laughter high and pure. Grace sat on a nearby bench, watching them. One girl tripped, then laughed instead of crying. Another helped her up. That simple act brought a lump to Grace's throat. The world had changed, or maybe she finally had. Her phone buzzed again, another message. This one from Emily. "How was the reunion, Mom? Did you see your old friends?" Grace typed slowly, "Yes. And I finally said goodbye to some old ghosts." Ben joined her a few minutes later with 2 cups of tea. "You look lighter," he said. "I think I am," she replied. "It's strange how forgiveness doesn't fix the past, but it unties it." They sat together in silence, sipping tea as the morning sun warmed their faces. The bakery bell rang faintly in the distance, and a soft breeze lifted a single leaf onto Grace's lap. She held it between her fingers, its veins delicate yet resilient. The reunion had been meant as nostalgia, a look back, but for Grace, it had become something else, entirely a door closing gently on decades of hurt. She no longer felt the need to explain, to prove, to justify. She turned to Ben and smiled. "Let's go home." He nodded, starting the car as she climbed in beside him. As they drove away, the banner outside the country club flapped in the wind, the words barely visible, but clear enough for her to read one last time. "Welcome back, class of 1994." Grace whispered, almost to herself, "Goodbye." The rumor, the final evening of the reunion, buzzed with polite laughter and half-finished goodbyes. Grace stood near the entrance of the hotel ballroom, waiting for Ben to bring the car around. She felt calm, lighter, almost foreign to herself. Then, from behind the floral arrangements, she heard the unmistakable hiss of whispered gossip. "Did you hear?" One woman said. "Grace Miller left early the first night. Couldn't handle seeing Lydia, I bet." Another voice joined in. "I don't blame her. Some people never outgrow embarrassment." Grace froze, the words cutting through her serenity like glass. 30 years later, and still, her name was a punchline. She turned slightly and saw 2 classmates from her old homeroom. both women she barely remembered. Their laughter was small but sharp. Ven appeared, sensing the tension. "Something wrong?" "Nothing," Grace said quietly. "Just history repeating itself." He followed her gaze and understood. "You don't need to prove anything," he whispered. "I know," she replied. "But maybe they do." Inside the ballroom, the reunion committee had arranged a farewell dinner, a last toast before everyone returned to their separate lives. Grace straightened her shoulders. "Let's go back in." The chatter inside dimmed as they entered. Lydia was already there, sitting at one of the front tables, a new stillness in her demeanor. Her makeup was simple, her laughter gone. When she saw Grace, she rose slightly, uncertain, almost deferential. Grace crossed the room, her heels echoing against the polished floor. Conversations paused. She stopped beside Lydia's table, offering a calm smile. "May I join you?" Lydia nodded wordlessly, eyes lowering, then took a seat beside Grace. The two gossiping women from the lobby sat a few tables away, watching with undisguised curiosity. The air was tight, full of expectation. When the host stood to offer closing remarks, he invited attendees to raise a glass to friendship and memory. Grace stood up before anyone else. Her voice carried steady and clear. "To truth," she said. The room quieted. "To the kind of friendship that takes time to understand, and to the courage it takes to let the past rest." There was a murmur of surprise, then a few tentative claps. Lydia slowly rose beside her, holding her glass as well. "And to second chances," she added softly. The applause grew stronger, filling the hall. The gossipers looked down at their plates, cheeks flushed. Grace caught their eyes briefly, not with triumph, but quiet certainty. The power they once held through whispers was gone. When everyone sat again, Lydia leaned toward her. "You didn't have to do that." Grace smiled faintly. "I wasn't doing it for you or for them. I did it for the girl I used to be." Lydia exhaled, a sound caught between relief and sorrow. "She'd be proud." "Maybe," Grace said, glancing at the stage. "But I think she'd just be glad we're still standing." As dinner resumed, conversations shifted back to lighter tones. The tension dissolved into the hum of music and laughter. Then squeezed Grace's hand under the table. "You handled that perfectly." Grace looked around the room, her gaze softening. "No, then. I just stopped letting other people write my story." When the dinner ended, Lydia touched her arm. "Thank you for not humiliating me. You already did that to yourself years ago," Grace said gently. "Now it's time we both stop." They shared a faint, fragile smile, the kind born not from friendship, but mutual exhaustion. For the first time, Grace saw Lydia as simply human, stripped of arrogance and regret alike. As she walked out of the ballroom, a soft rain began again outside, tapping against the tall windows. Grace paused and looked back one last time. The lights of the reunion shimmered through the glass, reflecting a world she no longer belonged to, no longer needed to. She whispered to herself, "Let them talk. I've already said everything that matters." Then she stepped into the rain, letting it wash away what little remained of the old wounds. The departure, morning light spilled through the thin curtains, soft and forgiving. Grace zipped her suitcase closed and looked around the hotel room one last time. The empty hangers in the closet, the folded receipt on the desk, the faint scent of coffee, all traces of a short but transformative trip. The reunion had ended, but something inside her still felt open, unfinished. Then knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Car's ready. You sure you don't want breakfast before we go?" Grace shook her head. "No, I just want to leave before the crowd wakes up." They took the elevator down in silence. The lobby was nearly empty except for a sleepy concierge, and the soft strains of a piano instrumental playing from hidden speakers. The air felt lighter, freer, as if the building itself had exhaled. Grace handed in her room key, thanked the clerk, and turned toward the glass doors. Near the entrance stood Lydia, holding a small paper bag. She looked composed, though the redness around her eyes betrayed a sleepless night. When she saw Grace, she hesitated, then approached slowly. "I was hoping to catch you before you left." Grace stopped. "You did." Lydia offered the bag. "Just something I found among my father's things. You should have it." Grace took it carefully. Inside was a framed photograph, the same one from the reunion slideshow, showing their fathers shaking hands, both smiling as if the world hadn't yet turned on them. Someone had cleaned the glass, polished the frame. Grace traced her thumb over the image. You kept this? Lydia nodded. I almost threw it away last night, but then I realized it's proof they once understood each other better than we ever did. Grace met her eyes. Maybe they were trying to teach us something. Maybe, Lydia whispered. The two women stood there for a moment, not as enemies or victims, but as witnesses to what time could destroy and what truth could rebuild. Lydia's hands fidgeted with her coat sleeve. Grace, I can't erase what I did, but if it means anything, I'm sorry, truly. Grace studied her face, searching for the arrogance that had defined her for decades. It was gone. What remained was something frail, genuine. You don't need to say it again, Grace said softly. Just live differently. Lydia's lips trembled into a half-smile. I will. Grace turned toward the exit. Take care of yourself, Lydia. You too, came the quiet reply. Outside, the morning air was cool and sweet. Rain had washed the pavement clean, leaving tiny mirrors of sunlight in every puddle. Ben loaded the luggage into the trunk and opened the passenger door for her. Grace glanced back once more. Through the glass, she saw Lydia still standing in the lobby, holding the spot where Grace had been as though afraid to move. When the car pulled onto the main road, Grace rested her head against the window. The town rolled past in snapshots: the bakery, the school, the park where she once ate lunch alone. Every place that had once carried shame now looked strangely peaceful. Ben glanced over. You all right? Grace smiled faintly. I think so. Closure? She thought for a moment. No, something better. Understanding. They passed the sign marking the city limits. Beyond it, the open highway stretched beneath a sky clearing into blue. Grace rolled down her window slightly, letting the wind tangle through her hair. She pulled out the photo again, studying the two men frozen in time. They forgave each other before we even knew, she murmured. Ben nodded. Then maybe that's where it started. The road wound ahead, long and bright. Grace felt the rhythm of the tires against the asphalt, steady and certain. The past was behind her now, not erased, but absorbed into the quiet strength she carried forward. As the hotel disappeared from view, she whispered, "Goodbye, Lydia, goodbye to all of it." For the first time in years, her voice didn't tremble. Homecoming, the familiar hum of the city, greeted Grace as the car turned onto her quiet street. The clouds had cleared completely, leaving the sky pale and endless. Her small house, with its ivy-covered porch and white shutters, looked exactly as it had when she'd left, a comforting constant after days of emotional storms. Emily rushed out to meet her before the engine stopped. "Mom," she called, waving both arms. Her smile was wide and real, unfiltered by the hesitation of adulthood. Grace barely had time to open the car door before Emily wrapped her in a fierce hug. "You're back early," Emily said breathlessly. "How was it? Did you see her?" Grace pulled back enough to meet her daughter's eyes. "Yes, I saw her. I saw everything." Emily frowned gently. "Everything?" Grace nodded. "Enough to finally stop carrying it." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh laundry. Ben carried the bags in, giving Emily a reassuring smile. Before heading to the kitchen, Grace set the framed photograph on the living room table. The image caught the sunlight, their father's handshake, glowing faintly beneath the glass. Emily noticed it immediately. "Who are they?" "My husband and Lydia's father," Grace said quietly. "The one who," Emily began, then stopped. "Yes," Grace finished for her. "The one who started it all, or maybe the one who tried to end it." Emily touched the frame, tracing the outline of the two smiling men. "So, what happened?" Grace took a deep breath and sank into the couch. "It turns out, the story I believed my whole life was a lie. Lydia's father blamed mine for something he didn't do, and she spent 30 years believing him." Emily's eyes widened. "That's awful." "It was," Grace said, "but not anymore." Ben entered with tea, setting it carefully on the table. "Because truth finally caught up," he said. Grace smiled at him, grateful for the steadiness in his voice. They sat together for a long moment, the sound of a distant lawn mower filling the silence. Grace realized how strange peace could feel uneasy at first, like walking in new shoes. "Mom," Emily said softly, "are you glad you went?" Grace thought for a moment, staring at the fading photograph. "Yes, but I didn't go to find friends. I went to find myself." Emily smiled, leaning her head on her mother's shoulder. "Then I guess you did." Afternoon sunlight warmed the room. Dust motes drifted lazily through the air. Grace felt the gentle rhythm of her daughter's breathing beside her, and thought of all the years she'd hidden her pain, careful not to pass it on. For the first time, she was certain she hadn't. "I'm proud of you," Emily whispered, "for forgiving her." Grace smiled faintly. "Forgiveness isn't for her, it's for me. I spent too long giving her power over my memories," then chuckled softly. "And now?" "Now," Grace said, "those memories belong to me again." She stood, walking to the window. The garden outside shimmered with late afternoon light. Roses her husband once planted had bloomed early this year, vibrant, alive, stubborn in their beauty. Grace turned back to her family, her heart steady. "Let's make dinner, something simple." Emily laughed. "You always say that, and it ends up being a feast." "Maybe this time, I'll mean it," Grace replied, her eyes bright. As they moved into the kitchen, Grace paused once more to glance at the photograph. The two men in it seemed to smile a little wider, or maybe it was just the light. She touched the frame lightly and whispered, "It's done." Outside, the wind stirred the ivy on the porch, gentle and constant, as if carrying her words away into the world that waited beyond her door. The afternoon sun hung low when Grace heard the knock on her door. It wasn't loud, just a hesitant tap that echoed through the quiet house. She dried her hands on a towel and walked to the entrance, half expecting a neighbor or a delivery. But when she opened the door, Lydia stood there dressed plainly, her posture uncertain. Grace blinked, taken aback. "Lydia, I hope this isn't a bad time," Lydia said. Her voice carried a humility Grace had never heard before. Grace hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." The living room was filled with the soft scent of brewed tea and lemon polish. Lydia looked around, her eyes landing on the framed photograph on the table. She froze, then smiled weakly. "He looks younger there." "So does your husband." "They were," Grace replied. "So were we." Lydia nodded and lowered herself onto the couch. Grace poured her a cup of tea without asking. The gesture, small and natural, seemed to catch Lydia off guard. For a moment, she just stared at the steam rising from the cup before whispering, "I visited your husband's grave this morning." Grace paused mid-pour. "You did?" Lydia nodded. "I thought it was the right thing to do. I didn't say much, just that I was sorry." The two women sat in silence. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Grace studied Lydia's face. The same features that once twisted with pride were now softened by exhaustion. Time, it seemed, had done what anger never could. Lydia set her cup down carefully. "You know, I told myself for years that you were weak, that being kind made you small." She laughed bitterly. "Turns out I was describing myself." Grace folded her hands in her lap. "We all protect lies that make us feel safe." Lydia looked down. "It took losing everything to realize how much of my life I wasted, proving I was better than you." Grace's expression softened. "We both lost things, but maybe we found something, too." The clock ticked again. A car passed outside. The light through the window shifted, falling gently on Lydia's face. She looked older than Grace remembered, but in that light, she also looked human, vulnerable, finally real. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Lydia said, her voice trembling. "I already did," Grace said simply, "the night I saw you break." Lydia swallowed hard. "Then maybe it's my turn to forgive myself." "That's harder," Grace said quietly, "but it's worth it." Lydia nodded, her eyes glistening. "I don't know how to start over." "Start small," Grace said. "Tell the truth. Be kind. Don't run from the mirror." For the first time in decades, Lydia laughed softly, almost shyly. "You sound like him," she said, glancing at the photograph. "Thomas, wasn't it?" Grace smiled faintly. "He believed people could change." Lydia stood to leave. "Thank you for letting me in." Grace followed her to the door. "You would have done the same." Lydia paused, her hand on the doorknob. "No," she admitted, "but I wish I had." They exchanged one last look, neither friendship nor farewell, but something gentler, an understanding stitched together from broken years. Lydia stepped outside, the sunlight catching in her hair. Grace watched her walk down the path toward the street, her shadow stretching long across the pavement. When Lydia reached the corner, she turned slightly and raised a hand. Grace returned the gesture before closing the door. The house felt quiet again, but not empty. Grace exhaled slowly, a soft peace spreading through her chest. She whispered to herself, "That's how it ends, not with anger, but with a door opening." and somewhere beyond the walls, the faint hum of life went on, steady, forgiving, and new. The letter from Lydia. 3 days passed quietly after Lydia's visit. Grace spent her mornings tending to her small garden, and her afternoons reading by the window. Life had returned to its gentle rhythm, but there was a strange awareness in the silence, as though the air itself waited for something unfinished. One morning, when Grace opened her mailbox, she found a pale blue envelope resting on top of the usual stack of bills and advertisements. Her name, Grace Miller, was written in a looping, elegant script she recognized immediately. Lydia's handwriting. She carried it inside carefully, setting it on the kitchen table beside her tea. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Then, taking a slow breath, she opened it. The letter began simply, "Grace, I hope you'll forgive me for writing instead of speaking. Sometimes words flow better when no one is watching you fail at finding them." Grace smiled faintly. She could almost hear Lydia's voice, wavering between confidence and regret. "After I left your house, I sat in my car for nearly an hour. I didn't want to start the engine. I didn't want to go back to a home filled with silence. But something you said stayed with me, that I should stop running from the mirror." Grace read on, her eyes tracing the delicate ink. "I've been thinking about what that means. My father raised me to believe that admitting weakness was worse than lying. He called it survival, but I see now that pride isn't survival, it's a cage. And I've lived in it for so long that I forgot what the air felt like outside." Grace paused, the words blurring slightly. She reached for her teacup, her fingers trembling just enough to spill a drop. "I visited your husband's grave again this morning. I brought flowers, the same kind my father once planted in our yard. When I was a child, I told him that I understand now. I told him that I'm sorry for what we both became because of one man's shame. I think he would have forgiven me, just like you did." Tears slipped down Grace's cheeks before she realized they had fallen. She kept reading. "I don't know where my life will go from here. The house feels too large, the silence too deep. But for the first time, I'm not afraid of that emptiness. It feels honest. Maybe that's what peace looks like at the start." The last lines were written more shakily, the ink darker, pressed hard into the paper. "You once said forgiveness is not for others, but for ourselves. I understand that now. Thank you for teaching me, even when I least deserved it. If you ever find yourself in need of a friend, not an old classmate, not a reminder of the past, but simply someone who understands, call me. I'd like to think we could build something new, from the truth this time." The letter ended without a signature, only a small pressed flower taped to the bottom corner. It was a white daisy, simple, unpretentious, fragile in its beauty. Grace folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She carried it to the mantel, and set it beside the photograph of their fathers. The two men smiled eternally from behind the glass, while the letter leaned gently against the frame like a quiet bridge between generations. She whispered, "She's learning." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain through the open window. Grace closed her eyes and listened. The past no longer hurt, it had softened into memory, and in that stillness, she realized Lydia's letter wasn't just an apology, it was proof that change, though slow and imperfect, was finally real. The story shared. A week later, the letter from Lydia still sat on Grace's mantel, beside the framed photograph of their fathers. Grace had read it more than once, each time feeling the weight of its honesty settle a little deeper in her heart. But this morning was different. She had decided it was time to tell her story, not to relive it, but to release it. Emily joined her at the kitchen table, laptop open, typing between sips of coffee. "What are you writing, Mom?" she asked. Grace smiled faintly. "Something for you, and maybe for anyone who's ever carried too much of the past." Emily pushed the laptop toward her. "You mean like a journal?" Grace nodded. "A story, maybe, but one that really happened." She began typing, her fingers steady. The words came easily this time, no hesitation, no shame. She wrote about the reunion, the letter, the discovery in the storage unit, and the truth that had untied years of resentment. She described Lydia's trembling voice, the way her father's lies had caged her, and the moment forgiveness stopped being just a word. When she finished, she leaned back, reading the last sentence aloud. "Sometimes forgiveness is not the end of a story, it's the beginning of another." Emily's eyes softened. "That's beautiful. You should share it. Who would want to read it?" Grace laughed quietly. "More people than you think. Emily said. There are a lot of people your age who've been hurt and never talked about it. Maybe they need to hear this. Grace hesitated. You think so, Mom? Emily said gently. You always told me truth heals faster when it's shared. So they spent the afternoon editing the piece together. Emily helped her post it online under a simple title, The Reunion That Changed Everything. Grace didn't expect anyone to read it. She only wanted to let it go. But by evening, the story had already found readers. Comments began to appear, strangers thanking her, people confessing their own stories of old wounds and unexpected forgiveness. One woman wrote, I went to my reunion last year. I wish I'd had your courage. Another said, my mother and I haven't spoken in 10 years. I'm calling her tonight. Emily read them aloud, smiling through tears. See, Mom? You didn't just forgive one person, you gave 100 others permission to do the same. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. She hadn't realized how many silent hearts existed in the world, all waiting for someone to speak first. I didn't mean to change anyone, she said softly. Emily squeezed her hand. You didn't try to. That's why it worked. Later that night, Grace sat alone by the window. The glow of the screen had faded, but her heart still hummed with quiet gratitude. Outside, the streetlights shimmered through the leaves. She whispered to herself, he'd be proud. Thomas, you always said one act of kindness could outlive the person who gave it. From the mantel, the letter and photograph watched over her, proof that even the most painful stories could turn into something that healed others. For the first time, Grace didn't see her past as something to bury. It was a bridge, not a burden, a story that no longer belonged to pain, but to peace. The ripple effect. By the end of the week, Grace's story had traveled farther than she could have imagined. What began as a quiet confession on a small blog was now being shared across social media, reposted by readers who saw themselves somewhere between her words. Messages poured into her inbox, some long, some barely a sentence, but each one carried the same gratitude. You helped me forgive my sister. I sent your story to my old teacher. Thank you for reminding me it's never too late. Grace scrolled through them slowly, her eyes filling with disbelief. I never wanted to be anyone's lesson, she murmured. Emily smiled from across the kitchen table. You didn't try to teach, you just told the truth. People needed that. Later that afternoon, Grace received an email from a local journalist who ran a community paper. The subject line read, would you share your story with our readers? She read the message twice before showing it to Emily. You should do it, Emily said. This is bigger than us now. Grace hesitated. It's still strange having strangers know my pain. Maybe it's not pain anymore, Emily replied. Maybe it's medicine. A week later, the article was published under the title Forgiveness at 60, One Woman's Story of Healing. It included the photo of Grace holding the framed picture of the two men, their handshake frozen in time. Beneath it, a caption read, a reunion that closed a 30-year circle. Neighbors began stopping by to tell her they'd read the piece. Some shared stories of their own estranged friends or families. Grace listened, realizing how many people carried invisible weights. It humbled her, but it also made her feel less alone. Then, one morning, she received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a short handwritten note. Your story reached my daughter before it reached me. She read it aloud at dinner, and for the first time in years, we talked. Thank you for both of us. Grace held the letter to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. The world had felt so small when she was young, boxed in by cruelty and shame. But now, her small story had rippled outward, touching lives she would never meet. That evening, she stood in her garden, watching the last of the day's light fall over the roses. Their petals glowed faintly pink under the setting sun. She thought of Lydia, wondering if she, too, had read the article, wondering if she felt the same quiet peace. Ben joined her, hands in his pockets. You've started something, he said. Grace shook her head. No, I just finished something. The rest started on its own. He smiled. That's how change works. You drop one pebble, and the water does the rest. She looked at the ripples in the bird bath nearby, the surface trembling with wind and reflection. Then I hope it keeps moving long after I'm gone. The evening breeze carried the faint scent of roses and rain. Grace closed her eyes and let it pass over her face, soft and cool. For the first time, she didn't wish to forget. The past had finally become a story worth remembering. Somewhere, She knew, others were reading her words, whispering forgiveness to names she'd never know. The ripples had reached them, and that was enough. Lydia's new beginning. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Lydia's house, landing on piles of unopened mail and dusty photo frames. The air was still but different, no longer suffocating, simply quiet. Lydia sat at the dining table, a cup of tea cooling beside her. Her hands rested on an open notebook, its pages blank, except for one line written in unsteady pen: begin again. She had read Grace's online story the night before. The words replayed in her mind: the reunion, the letter, the truth, forgiveness. Grace hadn't mentioned her name, but Lydia saw herself in every line. The shame burned at first, then slowly turned into something else: relief. The world finally knew the truth, and she no longer had to hide behind her father's ghost. She rose and began moving through the house, picking up the clutter that had gathered over years of neglect. The half-empty wine bottles went into the trash, the framed photographs into a box marked keep. When she came across the torn photo of her father, she paused. The two halves still fit perfectly together. She taped them gently and set the picture back on the mantel. In the afternoon, Lydia drove to the community center at the edge of town. A faded sign out front read: "Volunteers needed food drive." She parked and sat for a long moment, watching families carry boxes inside. Her instinct was to turn away, but she didn't. Instead, she grabbed her purse and walked in. A young woman at the reception desk smiled. "First time volunteering?" Lydia nodded. "Yes, I thought I'd try doing something useful." The woman handed her a clipboard. "We're glad to have you. We can always use extra hands." Hours passed quietly. Lydia sorted canned food, labeled boxes, and helped stack shelves. No one recognized her. No one expected her to be charming or important. It was oddly freeing when a child accidentally dropped a bag of rice and burst into tears. Lydia knelt and helped him scoop the grains back into the bag. "It's all right," she said gently. "Mistakes don't mean it's ruined." The boy smiled at her through his tears. That evening, when the work was done, Lydia walked outside. The sky was painted in soft pink and gold. She felt tired, but in a way that made her feel human again. For the first time in years, she wasn't pretending. Back home, she wrote another line beneath the first in her notebook: "Today, I did something good." She glanced at the framed letter. Grace had sent her after the article went viral. It read, "Simply, we all start over differently. You're doing fine." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes, but they weren't heavy ones. She smiled through them. The phone rang. It was the coordinator from the center. "Lydia, we're short on volunteers for the weekend. Would you be willing to help again?" She laughed softly. "Yes, I'd like that." After she hung up, Lydia stepped onto her porch. The air was cool, the street quiet except for crickets. Somewhere far away, she imagined Grace sitting in her own home, maybe reading, maybe smiling. Lydia whispered into the dusk, "Thank you." It wasn't for the forgiveness alone, it was for the chance to live differently. She turned off the porch light, the notebook still open on the table behind her. Under the single word "begin," the page waited patiently for the next sentence. Returning to the school, the morning was crisp and bright when Grace parked her car near the old high school. The building stood almost unchanged: same red brick, same iron gates, same tall oak trees whispering in the breeze. Only the sign was new: "Welcome to Lincoln High, where every story matters." Grace smiled at the words. If they'd been there 30 years ago, maybe things would have been different. She adjusted her scarf and stepped through the gates, her shoes clicking softly against the familiar path. Inside, the halls buzzed with the sound of students. Lockers slammed, laughter spilled across the corridor, and sneakers squeaked on the polished floor. Grace felt a strange blend of nostalgia and distance, like walking through a photograph she no longer belonged in. A teacher spotted her near the main office. "Mrs. Miller? You're here for the assembly?" "Yes," Grace said, smiling. "Emily told me you invited alumni to speak." The teacher nodded enthusiastically. "Your story inspired quite a few of us. We thought the students should hear about it directly." Grace's heart fluttered. "I didn't realize anyone here read it." "Oh, they did," the teacher said, handing her a visitor badge. "It started a whole project about empathy and storytelling. You'll see." The auditorium filled slowly, rows of restless teenagers, whispering and tapping on their phones. Grace stood backstage, holding a small notecard she didn't need. When the principal introduced her, she stepped into the light. For a moment, she froze. Hundreds of faces looked up at her, the same kind of faces that once turned away, but these eyes were curious, not cruel. She began softly, "When I was your age," she said, "I thought silence was safety. I believed that if I stayed quiet, I could disappear from pain. But silence doesn't protect you, it preserves what hurt you." The room stilled. A few students lowered their phones. "I went to a reunion recently," Grace continued, her voice steadier now. "I met someone who once made me feel small. I thought confronting her would fix the past. It didn't. Forgiving her did." A hand went up in the front row. "Was it hard?" a girl asked. "Yes," Grace answered. "It took 30 years, but it's never too late to stop being who someone else decided you were." The applause was soft at first, then stronger. Grace felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. After the talk, several students approached her. One boy said, "My dad doesn't talk to his sister. I'm gonna show him your story." Another girl whispered, "People say things about me too. Maybe one day I'll forgive them." Grace knelt so their eyes met. "You don't have to wait 30 years, she said gently. "You can start now." As the crowd dispersed, the principal thanked her, promising to make her talk a yearly tradition. Grace left the building with a light heart. Outside, she paused beneath the old oak tree that had shaded her. During lonely lunch hours, she rested her hand against its trunk, feeling its rough bark, the same one she'd once carved her initials into as a girl trying to belong. She whispered, "We made it, didn't we?" The leaves rustled in reply, scattering sunlight over her face. Grace turned toward the parking lot, where Ben waited by the car. He waved, and she waved back. As she walked away, she didn't feel the weight of the past anymore, only gratitude that she had lived long enough to rewrite it. The newspaper story. 2 weeks later, Grace sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, the morning paper folded neatly beside her. The front page headline wasn't about politics or whether it was about her. Local woman's reunion story inspires nationwide movement for forgiveness. The article featured a large photo of Grace, standing in front of her old high school, smiling gently, one hand resting on the oak tree she'd once carved her initials into. Beneath the image, the caption read, "Grace Miller's story reminds us that it's never too late to heal." Grace chuckled softly. "I look taller than I remember," she said aloud. Ben appeared behind her with his coffee mug. "That's because you're standing straight for once," he teased. Grace smiled, shaking her head. "I never imagined this would go so far." He set his mug down beside hers. "You didn't imagine it because you weren't chasing it. That's why people trust you." She skimmed the article again. It recounted how her story had gone viral, how schools and community groups across the country were organizing forgiveness forums, inspired by her words. The reporter had even mentioned Lydia without using her name as a woman once, burdened by her father's pride. There was one quote that made Grace pause. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering without bitterness." She read it twice. "That was something Thomas used to say," she murmured, then leaned closer. "Then it's fitting the world finally hears it." Later that afternoon, the phone rang. It was the newspaper's editor. "Mrs. Miller," he said warmly, "your story is making waves. We've had hundreds of letters to the editor thanking you. Some even want to start a foundation in your name." Grace laughed softly. "That's kind, but unnecessary. I'm just one person," the editor replied. "Sometimes one person is all it takes to remind others to begin." After hanging up, Grace sat quietly for a while. The weight of everything, years of silence, anger, grief, felt like it had finally settled into something solid, something meaningful. She picked up her pen and wrote a small note on a scrap of paper. "If the past must live, let it teach." She pinned it to her refrigerator and smiled. That evening, Emily dropped by for dinner, holding a copy of the same newspaper. "Mom, my friends won't stop talking about you. You're officially famous." Grace groaned. "Please don't say that. Fame isn't my style." Emily laughed. "Then what do you call changing lives?" Grace thought for a moment. "Maybe just being honest." After dinner, they took a walk through the neighborhood. The air smelled faintly of lilac and rain. Neighbors waved and smiled. One elderly man stopped to thank her for the beautiful article. Grace blushed, unused to attention. When they reached the park, Grace sat on a bench. watching children chase each other near the swings. Emily sat beside her. "You know," Emily said, "Dad would have loved this." Grace nodded. "He believed kindness had echoes. I didn't understand until now." A breeze rustled the trees overhead, scattering petals across their laps. Grace brushed one away and whispered, "I think the echo's still going." As the sun dipped below the horizon, she folded the newspaper and tucked it into her purse, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, a symbol of how pain, when shared truthfully, could transform into something far larger than the person who endured it. She stood, linking her arm through Emily's. "Come on," she said with a smile. "Let's go home before the world decides to print another headline." The charity gala. 3 months later, Grace received an invitation that made her pause mid-breakfast. The envelope was elegant, gold-trimmed, and embossed with the emblem of the Dalton Foundation, the charity Lydia had revived in her father's name. Grace turned it over, reading the note inside. Annual Charity Gala for Community Renewal. Guest of Honor Grace Miller. Hosted by Lydia Dalton. Her breath caught for a moment. The idea of stepping back into Lydia's world, even now, stirred something uneasy in her. But when Ben read over her shoulder, he smiled. "You have to go," he said. "You started this together, whether you meant to or not." Grace looked at him skeptically. "I'm not sure the word together ever applied to us." Ben chuckled. "Then maybe this is the first time it does." The night of the gala was clear and cool. The event hall shimmered under strands of golden lights, every table draped in white linen and adorned with simple flowers. Grace entered quietly, wearing a dark navy gown that matched the calm she carried now. Conversations hushed briefly as people turned to recognize her, the woman whose story had inspired a movement. Across the room, Lydia stood at the podium, radiant yet grounded. Her hair was swept back simply, no jewels, no excess. When her eyes found Grace, a small, genuine smile appeared. She stepped down from the stage and crossed the room without hesitation. "Grace," she said, her tone steady but warm. "You came." Grace smiled back. "I couldn't refuse an invitation this beautiful." Lydia gestured to the tables. "We've raised enough this year to fund 3 youth centers. The foundation is growing faster than I dreamed." "I read about it," Grace said. "You're doing good work." Lydia exhaled softly, trying to. "I thought rebuilding something under my father's name would hurt, but it feels like healing." A photographer approached timidly. "Would you two mind a photo together?" Lydia looked at Grace for permission. Grace nodded. They stood side by side, the flash capturing a moment neither could have imagined a year ago. 2 women once divided by bitterness, now linked by forgiveness. During dinner, Lydia took the stage again to address the guests. Her speech was short, humble, heartfelt. "This foundation isn't just about money or rebuilding walls," she said, her voice echoing across the room. "It's about rebuilding people. I learned that from someone who once had every reason to hate me and chose not to." All eyes turned briefly toward Grace. She lowered her gaze, her heart swelling with quiet pride. After the applause faded, Lydia returned to Grace's table. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," she said softly. "You didn't," Grace replied. "You honored what matters." They shared dessert in companionable silence, no longer needing to fill the space with apologies or explanations. Near the end of the evening, Lydia handed Grace a small envelope. "It's not another letter," she said with a grin. "Just an invitation to join the board." Grace laughed lightly. "You really don't give up, do you?" "Not on good things," Lydia replied. Grace opened the envelope, reading the simple line inside together, "We begin again." As the guests began to leave, the 2 women stepped out onto the balcony. Below them, the city lights shimmered across the river. "You know," Lydia said, looking out, "I used to think forgiveness was weakness." Grace smiled. "And now?" "Now I know it's the only thing that makes people strong enough to start over." They stood side by side, watching the reflection of the city dance on the water. For the first time, Grace felt not just peace, but kinship. "Good night, Lydia," she said as they parted. "Good night, Grace," Lydia replied. The door closed softly behind her, but Grace knew it wasn't an ending, just another beginning. Written by 2 women who had finally learned how to live beyond their pain. The final meeting. A year had passed since the charity gala. Seasons had turned quietly, and the world had moved on. But for Grace and Lydia, something lasting had taken root, a fragile friendship built on truth. They didn't see each other often, but letters, calls, and small acts of kindness had become their unspoken rhythm. It was late spring when Lydia called unexpectedly. Her voice, though calm, carried a faint tremor. "Grace," she said, "I'm in town for a few days. I'd like to see you if you're free." Grace smiled softly. "Of course. Same cafe as last time?" "No," Lydia said after a pause. "I was hoping we could meet somewhere quieter." That afternoon, Grace drove to the botanical garden just outside the city. The paths were lined with blooming cherry trees, their petals floating like pink snow. She found Lydia sitting on a wooden bench near the koi pond, a scarf around her shoulders despite the warmth. "You look tired," Grace said gently, taking a seat beside her. Lydia smiled faintly. "I've been in and out of hospitals lately. Nothing dramatic, just reminders that life is shorter than we pretend." Grace's chest tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Lydia said. "It's strange, but I'm not afraid anymore. I've lived more in this last year than I did in the 30 before it." They sat in silence for a while, watching the koi ripple through the water. The air smelled of earth and new blossoms. Finally, Lydia reached into her bag and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "I wanted to give you this," she said, "before time decides for me." Grace unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with 2 small charms, an engraved daisy and a letter G. "It's beautiful," Grace whispered. "The daisy," Lydia said softly, "is for that letter I sent you, the one with the flower pressed inside. The G is for you and maybe for Grace itself." Grace's eyes glistened. "Lydia, don't make it dramatic," Lydia said with a teasing smile. "I'm just tying up loose ends, the good kind." They sat for another hour, sharing stories of ordinary days, books they'd read, food they'd cooked, small things that made the world still feel alive. Grace realized that Lydia no longer spoke with the brittle pride that once defined her. Her words were slower, gentler, as if every sentence was chosen with care. When the sky began to tint orange, Lydia stood, her scarf fluttering lightly. "I should go," she said. "I'm tired." Grace rose too. "Let me drive you." Lydia shook her head. "No, I'll take a cab. I want to walk a little while first." She hesitated, then took Grace's hand. "You saved me, you know." Grace squeezed her fingers. "No, you just decided to stop drowning." Lydia laughed softly, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. "You always did say things that cut straight through." They hugged a long, wordless embrace that carried everything left unsaid. When Lydia finally pulled away, she smiled through her tears. "Thank you for giving me peace," Grace replied, her voice trembling. "And you for teaching me courage." Lydia nodded once, turned, and walked slowly down the garden path. The wind stirred the fallen petals around her feet, scattering them into the air like blessings. Grace watched until she disappeared among the trees. For a moment, everything was still: the pond, the blossoms, even the sound of her own breath. Then, softly, she whispered, "Goodbye, my friend." She looked down at the bracelet in her palm, the daisy charm, catching the last of the sunlight. A small smile curved her lips. It wasn't grief she felt, it was gratitude pure and complete, because after decades of silence and pain, both women had found what they were searching for: not redemption, not revenge, but understanding. And as Grace walked away through the fading light, she knew the story that began in cruelty had ended in something far more powerful: kindness that would outlive them both. The end.